So I'll be presenting the ManyBabies Demographics project, but it's really, I'm making a presentation on behalf of the entire team. It's really a large and interdisciplinary international team. So I just wanted to start by introducing the team on a slide, so that these are all of the researchers that have contributed to different aspects of the project, offering both their expertise in the kinds of demographics that we're looking at, the constructs, but also trying to sort of diversify and create a demographic tool that is adaptable across different contexts. So we're lucky enough to have an internationally diverse team with different sort of lived experiences and also expertise in different contexts. So what started the ManyBabies Demographics project was really the notion that infants, of course, develop in many different diverse contexts. And they have a range of different experiences that inevitably affect their behaviors and affect the results or the data that we see in laboratory settings. However, the impact of context or of cultural diversity, contextual diversity, is often unstated in research reports. So we often talk about infants doing something, or human infants, based on what is often a narrow and homogeneous sample of infants from particular settings. So I think this is particularly relevant to infant research and what it contributes to psychological research in general, because infants are often used as sort of a test vehicle to really understand the initial state of psychological organization, to make broad commentaries on innateness, universality, and to discern biological versus environmental influences. It's often infants that are invoked in nature versus nurture debates, or used as recruited as evidence for universal processes in development. So for this reason, demographic context is particularly important, because the nature of the environment inevitably shapes the way in which infants behave in their in laboratory testing or in psychological research. And demographic variables in general, sorry, turn this off, in general are not reported, but I just wanted to give a sense of the reporting of demographic variables in infant research in particular. So on the right, you can see a chart of the world, a world map. And this chart plots the proportion of infant studies over the last 10 years in the major developmental journals: child development, developmental psychology, developmental science, and infancy. And you can see that there isn't even distribution. There's quite a lot of imbalance in representation across the world. If we look at what people actually say about their infant participants in terms of the demographics, I'll present different aspects of demographics in sequence. So in terms of race and ethnicity, you can see that more than half of the studies published on infant development, in child development, developmental science, infancy, and developmental psychology over the past 10 years don't report race and ethnicity of their participants. So I'll go into this when we get to the ManyBabies demographic tools, but I think this is one of the more complex demographics to report. It's not always legal to obtain this information, and obviously it can be sensitive information. In terms of representation of national origin, you can see there's an overwhelming skew, which actually hasn't changed across the decade, towards participants from North America and regions of Western Europe. So that accounts for nearly 90% of participants over the past 10 years. And in terms of socioeconomic status, again, this is complex to report, it's complex to interpret, but for the most part, researchers don't report participant socioeconomic status in empirical papers, unless socioeconomic status is being used as an independent variable to study behavior. So in general, we don't know much about the SES of our participants who are in our studies. And when it is reported, studies tend to favor mid-SES or mid to high SES infants. And so I then looked at language exposure, because this is the one area of infant development where perhaps you would expect reporting of language exposure. But as you can see, there's a high proportion. This is from a recent review by Kidd and Garcia of disciplinary journals on language. And you can see there's a very high proportion of studies for which language exposure isn't reported in language journals about children's language experience. So in general, there's a tendency to not report demographic information. and to omit information that actually could be sort of a hidden moderator or a latent determinant of infants' behavior. So there are several reasons that I think that sort of motivate this project why we should report demographic data. So first, we should be accurately and faithfully characterizing our samples. So instead of saying, for example, based on 20 infants or 30 infants show X ability, we should really be saying infants in this particular context show X ability. But we can't do that if we don't report the context, and we don't know what the context is. And related to this is the very important question of generalizability of research findings. So as we know, psychology in general is going through a reputational crisis around replicability, generalizability. And part of addressing this crisis or addressing this problem, I think involves really scaling generalizability to the nature of the data. So if we really just have 20 infants from Boston, Massachusetts, then that is a different scale of generalizability than having very large scale studies that are widely dispersed across different settings. And demographic variables can also provide a mirror into sociocultural context. So people's demographics affects who it influences who they are, but also affects the way in which they interact with the world. And so to some extent, reporting of demographics can also provide insight into the sociocultural context within which infants are raised. So that's sort of the issue of reporting demographic data and just stating in your paper that these infants are from this population and can be characterized in these ways. But there's the secondary issue of not just reporting the data, but actually integrating that into your narrative about infant development. So as I mentioned, in many ways, demographic data may actually moderate infant behaviors in ways that are latent or hidden from research reports. And at a theoretical level, this understanding these moderators, understanding the effects of demographics can illuminate sources of variability and constancy in infant development, which is a very sort of weighty issue in our understanding and studies of infant development. So even very seemingly, and these are a few examples of myriad examples of the ways in which very seemingly basic behaviors can be demographically variable. So for example, the time and the way in which infants learn to become independent in terms of locomotion really varies depending on the opportunities that they have for independent movement in their early months and years. The way in which infants connect with and attach to adults or caregivers in their environment can be really variable depending on the context within which infants find themselves. And the kinds of language that infants produce and the determinants of that language can vary depending on where infants are raised and the environment within which they find themselves. So these very basic abilities, walking, talking, connecting, are not stable across cultures. They seem to vary quite drastically across different settings. So I don't think we can take for granted that infant behavior in some form or manifestation is necessarily stable across different contexts. So what are the challenges to this project and to obtaining and reporting demographic data? So I've classified this in terms of individual laboratories, which face their own challenges in collecting demographic data, but also in terms of big team science. So what are some of the ways in which constellations of labs, or large-scale collaborations face their own difficulties that are different in collecting demographic data? So for individual laboratories, I think this phrase sort of theoretically relevant demographic characteristics is a little bit hard to interpret. What is a theoretically relevant demographic characteristic? Well, I think for the most part, we just really don't know. And so we have to, on one hand, think about an inclusive approach. On the other hand, we want to collect a manageable amount of information. So I think there's a tension between sort of a wish list and then what's really possible when you have an infant in a laboratory for half an hour or an hour. Even if you select your variables, how do you operationalize these variables? So if you take a variable that you think to be important, so race or community of descent, how do you define that? You may define that by race and ethnicity, but obviously you want to define that in a way that's valid in your context and that's accessible information for participants, and that is sort of faithful to the the construct that you're trying to measure. And of course, there are ethical and legal requirements around collecting personal information. So many demographic dimensions like socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity can really rely on asking participants for information that they may or may not feel comfortable providing, but furthermore, which may or may not be allowed in your particular setting. In terms of collecting demographic data in sort of big team science or ManyBabies or these very large scale collaborations where laboratories are coming together, hoping to have some sort of standardized way of collecting demographic data. There are challenges in standardizing the process of data collection. So how are you asking for this information? What information are you asking for? And in data treatment. So here I think laboratories face a tension between collecting information that's standard at the front end, so just giving the exact same questionnaire, which is convenient and expedient, but that can lead to difficulties because the exact same questionnaire may not be equally suitable across settings. Once you have an adapted questionnaire, then you have back-end complications in coding those data to aggregate and harmonize the data across these different settings. So that tension, I think, can be challenging to resolve. So ManyBabies Demographics, the goal of the project is really to generate a one-page questionnaire to capture demographic details. And so here I'll say very emphatically that this is not an all-inclusive questionnaire. If you're interested, for example, in studying bilingualism, you would probably not find the 1 or 2 questions on this questionnaire satisfying for a study where bilingualism is an independent variable. So it's really to collect the lowest common denominator of demographic information. And it's really to address the gap that I think stood out in the pie charts in the beginning of this presentation, to just provide some information to the reader and to our field about the participants that we're sampling. We've thought about this questionnaire in, well, I would say our thinking has evolved considerably over the last, I've lost count how many months and years this has been going on for, but what we've converged on now is the notion that the kinds of questions that people would ask would be highly variable across contexts. So for that reason, the project is focused on broad categories of demographic information and constructs that map onto those categories, with the idea that the categories are invariant across different laboratories. The constructs are contextually adapted. I'll go into some examples of this next. And the items are really developed by the researchers within their local community. So the way in which you ask about percentage of language exposure may really vary depending on the population that you're working with. So in approaching this task, we had 4 principles in mind. We prioritized 4 things: construct validity, inclusivity, flexibility, and cumulativity. So we wanted constructs that were developmentally appropriate for infants, which are often different from constructs that are used for children or adults, that are theoretically and empirically relevant, that are culturally adapted, that are inclusive, so they can be used across a variety of settings, and they could be used in consultation with local informants to really generate culturally specific items. But we wanted something that was flexible, that could be adapted across different settings, with items developed on the ground with local expertise, and therefore having very site-specific construct selection and item development. And something that was cumulative. So we see this as a living product that would keep evolving and being revised. And just like the MCDI, for example, the MacArthur CDI, this is something that people could adapt locally and contribute their adaptations to an open source repository that other researchers could use. So we settled on 6 key categories, and we had working groups that had expertise in each of these areas or interest in each of these areas. And they worked together to think about how these categories would map onto particular constructs. So we settled on biographical information, gestational status, developmental concerns, community of descent, caregiving environment, and socioeconomic status. And these constructs map onto different categories. So this chart made by Heidi shows us the categories, which are sort of the superordinate level at which we capture demographic. And those categories map onto particular constructs. So if we take community of descent, that's a broad category about your ancestral lineage. And one way in which you would measure community of descent is by looking at race and ethnicity. And the way in which you ask about race and ethnicity would really vary depending on what was appropriate for your context. So you may, for example, decide to develop race ethnic categories, or you may ask participants about using questions that are their local census categories, for example. So those things have to be developed on site. And so what our project focuses on is identifying these categories, identifying these constructs, offering examples of particular items that could be helpful to researchers, but leaving that really open for researchers to develop with grounded expertise. We have different survey variations, or working on different variations. So we have come up with a level 1 survey. So that's really a very expedient form of data collection, that if you're in a museum or you're in a childcare center and you just have 2 minutes with the parents while they drop off, what's a very, very quick survey that you could give to them in a short amount of time that would yield valid and useful data. And then we have level 2, which is a more elaborate format for in-lab administration, where you might have 10 minutes versus 2 minutes. And you may be able to actually do this in an interview format versus just handing a clipboard over to the parents. So the difference between level 1 and level 2 is that level 1 really asks questions that are more elemental, more basic, and level 2 asks about the same constructs and the same categories, but in greater detail. We're also thinking about the medium of administration. So right now it's a paper and pencils or computer survey, but we would like to put it onto Qualtrics and other survey platforms that may be accessible to different researchers. So online versus paper administration, and also potentially having it deliverable over a smartphone. So using technology to speed up the process of data collection and make it easier for some parents to enter in these data. So lastly, what is the current status of the project? We are focusing right now on working with the working groups for these different 6 different categories on refining the specific constructs that would map onto these different categories. And we're developing adaptations for different contexts. So we're planning to provide, similar to the MCDI, some samples across different geographical regions of the world, but we really can't offer one survey for the entire globe. We really rely on this being an interaction with researchers, where researchers who use the survey adapt it and provide feedback on it, and also come back to us with versions they may have developed that would be useful for their context that other researchers can use. So we see it really as something that's iterative, and that we then sort of converge on a final set of surveys that participants can use across diverse settings. We're developing an open source platform for sharing these adaptations to make it easier for people not to be sharing through back channels, but really to be able to have a central repository for this information that everybody can access and make use of. And then also providing guidelines for ethical and legal considerations in administration. So I think many of us are used to an IRB board that reviews our tools and questions. But if you don't have access to that information, that resource, and even if you do have access to that resource, there are additional ethical considerations and legal considerations that have to be factored in when asking about things that that are often sort of personal information. So that's where we are now, and I just wanted to say I'm very happy to engage with anybody on this project, and I welcome any form of participation and collaboration. And I think what we really need at this stage is researchers across different contexts to kind of help to test drive what we have and to give feedback on what we've developed to sort of improve and refine the survey that we have. So that's all for me. Thank you. And I'm happy. I don't know if we have time for questions or if we should move on.
Thanks, Leher. That was really great. I think we could take time for one question. We got started a couple minutes late, and we also, there's a break after this session. So I think we don't have to be too worried about ending right at the exact time. If anybody has a question for Leher before we move on.
Yeah, this is really great. I was wondering, is one of the goals to ultimately be able to like look at relationships between these demographic variables and other cognitive or social measures? And if so, how would you imagine doing that across all the different versions?
Sorry, Liz, it broke up a little bit. Do you mind repeating, looking at, I heard infants across different settings?
Yeah, sorry. So for example, if you wanted to know, does socioeconomic status correlate with performance on a task, how would you imagine doing that, given that there's a lot of different versions of this questionnaire across contexts?
Yeah, so you picked the one category that is the thorniest in our discussions for reasons that you point out, that these, I mean, most studies use composite measures of SES, but even what goes into those composite measures really varies. And the acceptability of asking for things like income or even education can vary across different contexts. So our guidance is to actually have that be ad hoc. So if a group of 5 labs comes together and decides to collaborate, for them to evaluate the tension between front-end uniformity and back-end coding, and to come up with something that works for that collaboration. But it's precisely for the reason that you point out, that we went from coming up with items that we thought we could just hand over to actually focusing on constructs and categories and letting the research teams come up with specific items. But yeah, the other part of your question is, are we actually going to look at these demographic characteristics in response, in connection with behavior? And I hope so. I hope that this provides enough yield and validity for these demographic variables actually to be tools for analysis.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Leher.